Okay, and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. I am Carm McDonald. I am the Director of Education here for UXPA International, and I'll be your moderator for our panel discussion today. We're super excited to be joined by awesome panel of professionals, but there are a few housekeeping items that I want to go over before we jump right in. So all audio is muted with the exception of myself and the panelists who will be speaking. We do have a Q&A slated out towards the end of our panel discussion. So if you do have any questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A window of the control panel. So I know some of us are in the chat and some of us are probably talking in the chat, but let's keep the questions to the Q&A window specifically. All right, the webinar is recorded and will be made available to you days after this discussion has concluded. Upcoming next, we have a short course, which is UX methodology for data visualization, and another webinar in November, Visual Note-Taking 101, with a local Chicago company called Ink Factory. So that should be a pretty fun one. So if you notice, our October and November short courses and webinars are going to be particularly focused around the theme of data visualization. So with that, if you want to keep updated of future courses and webinars, please feel free to visit us on uxpa.org and be sure to visit the Education tab. And we've just gotten a relaunch of our uxpa.org website, so be sure to go and visit and check that out as well. All right, so I think what everybody is here and what they're waiting for is Agile for UX and product teams. So we're all excited to go ahead and jump into this discussion. And before we get into it, I'm just going to do a round robin, have our panelists introduce themselves, tell us their name, what they specifically do, so their actual title, and who they do it for. And then we'll start off with the questioning. So let's go in order of the video. So let's kick it off with Marina.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me, Carm. I'm Marina Barrick. I'm the design lead at Capital One for card acquisitions.
Thanks, Marina. Carlene.
Hi, I'm really excited to be here. I am Carlene Davis, and I am a principal delivery lead at Soulstice, meaning that I lead Agile teams to transform the way we work and deliver products.
Great. Thanks, Carlene. Spencer.
Hey, Carm, thanks for hosting this and having me here. My name is Spencer Hockborn. I'm a senior technical consultant for Soulstice, and I primarily focus on web application development.
Thank you. And last but not least.
So I'm Bryan Crowley. I'm a senior product designer at Allstates in the UXD org, working in the Compose labs in the merchandise market.
Okay, great. Well, thank you guys for joining me today. Thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us for this panel. I know that, you know, we follow each other on LinkedIn. Everyone has an opinion about this popular topic, Agile, and how it actually works for product teams and how that methodology works specifically for development. But the question that our members have, and a question that, you know, I'm interested in having answered myself is, how does Agile actually work outside of product teams, but more so with UX? So in kicking off the conversation, I want Spencer, who comes from the development side of the house, to tell us what's the methodology that's used in your organization and kind of define Agile in your own terms.
Okay, well, Soulstice is a digital innovation firm, so we do consulting for many different clients, and a lot of times we kind of do different methodologies for different clients, kind of depending on their needs. But for the most part, most of the development product creation is done using the Scrum Agile methodology. And the reason for that is that we kind of break out into very specific roles. We have the developers, we have the QAs, we have the Scrum Masters, the product consultants, the UX designers. We often have researchers and strategists, and just that kind of structure really works more towards that Scrum methodology. And then each team kind of, determines with the client what's best in terms of how many weeks in a sprint, what ceremonies are going to work best. But, you know, for the most part, we have like the standard Scrum ceremonies like stand-ups and refinements, sprint plannings and retrospectives and things like that. But it really does depend on the client. Agile for me, it's funny because I've worked at about 4 different places, and each one kind of has their own kind of idea of what Agile is. But Agile for me is more incremental development, moving towards initially an MVP, so a minimum viable product, and then kind of adding onto that as you go. A main difference I feel like between Agile and Waterfall is the ability to kind of make changes as you move along, to be able to potentially move delivery dates and things like that, and not just to get this giant like goal that's, you know, a year and a half in the future and say, build this. You know, try to avoid things like scope creep and just like excessive features that maybe don't need to go in right away. Personally, and I'll speak for myself and try to avoid speaking for all developers out there, but I really feel like Agile works really well for developers, just because instead of having a year and a half to build a feature and not knowing how to like time box that, you get maybe a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks to build out something or a feature, and that kind of keeps you regimented going forward.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Spencer, for providing that point of view from the developer perspective. But I know I do have Marina and Bryan on the phone, who are both practitioners in UX. Tell me how you guys see Agile, and feel free, either one of you, to jump in to answer that question.
I can take it. I agree with everything that Spencer said in terms of that it's really awesome. It's an awesome methodology to get work into market, especially if you're working on 2-week sprints. And then the methodology behind it, which is the ability to test and see the results and rapidly change, is just as important for UX as it is for tech teams. I would say that one of the things that I really appreciate about working in Agile is the ability to influence the backlog. So when you are thinking about what the team is delivering next as a UX practitioner, I can speak up on behalf of the customer for what features I think they would benefit most from, especially when we're having trade-off discussions. So, so many of us in design are used to delivering a complete package with the ultimate happy path and all of the bells and whistles, and we make a lot of concessions in delivery along the way. And being able to work in Agile means that we have a better picture about what concessions we're making when, and when we're going to have fast followers to market, so that we can plan maybe a really large feature to be released in the beginning, followed by some supporting smaller features. And I feel like I have a better handle on what product is being released to customers that way.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Right.
I agree with Marina and Spencer. So our methodology is XP, which is extreme programming. Includes paired design and paired programming. So it means 2 people, 1 computer, and you're sitting side by side and you're working together to solve problems fast and work in 1-week sprints. And we're all co-located on 1 table that we refer to as a boat all together. Pivotal Labs kind of brought that methodology about 4 years ago over to Allstate, and Allstate created the Composed Labs model from that. And I love it because that way, like, the developers are in discovery, the designers are in delivery. Like that way, like when you're having those conversations and you're able to quickly shift and quickly change things. And as the developers are discovering things, the designers are able to communicate, and it truly lives up to the Agile Manifesto principle of communication over documentation, which is incredibly valuable.
Great, thanks for sharing that. And that kind of brings me to a point, Bryan. You said developers are kind of in discovery and UX is in delivery. Tell me a little bit about what that workflow is like in a 2-week sprint for a UX designer versus a developer. I'm curious to hear how, Marina and yourself are maybe doing that differently. Because again, Bryan, you said that this is kind of a pair programming specifically for Allstate, just slightly different from what Marina's organization is like.
Yeah, I mean, it means that I pair with developers sometimes, or I pair with the PMs sometimes to get work done. It means that the developers' feet are not stapled or nailed to the floor. That they get up and they come and they join and they'll go on interviews. We had developers on the GHRN team come with us on ride-alongs to ride with the rescuers to see what the actual products, what was going on with the product in action. And they had insights and they had insights into how the product was being used, which was great, but they also started to build empathy towards what was happening with the user on the end product that they were delivering. And likewise, us getting into the delivery, we did things where we were posting the postman up to be able to test products and kind of understand the test-driven development and how they run unit tests. In the current role that I'm in, I'm working on automation processes that are on the back end that are specifically products designed for developers. So sitting with the developers, understanding them, but then also like bringing them into having them as users as well, and having them like kind of do the research role and also kind of being the users is incredibly valuable.
Okay, great. Marina, did you have anything you wanted to add on to that?
Yeah, I would say that the way that I work now is different from true Agile, and internally we don't even subscribe to the terminology of dual track, but I would describe it as dual track. The team that I'm on works on a horizontal platform that so many other teams touch. So sometimes we're taking on a hands-on approach, and sometimes we're taking on a consulting approach. In that way, I wouldn't say that I'm completely dedicated to Agile, but depending on the project that I'm working on, I will be working really closely with a product owner, a product manager, a dedicated tech team. We collaborate in Slack and over email, and we have shared project management tools. I think what's interesting is sometimes I can be dedicated to delivering with that team and being able to pivot on a day-to-day basis without having all of the ceremonies that are necessarily dedicated to Agile. So we don't have a stand-up. I trust my team to be delivering. I trust the product owner and the tech teams to be delivering on features that we've previously discussed until something comes up. So for instance, we'll run into some technical errors. We'll need a new user flow to mitigate that risk. And I'll be pulled in and we'll have a meeting of the minds where we can pull something together really quickly in a week and then put that into delivery. And then I can be dedicated back to a more discovery track and creating more robust flows versus being tactical day to day. So I know that was a lot, and it's not necessarily being dedicated to Agile, but I think it's interesting when you think about the delivery flow, how you can have a meeting of the minds to work in an Agile way, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a day-to-day ceremonial process to still be effective.
That's a really interesting perspective, if I can add something. At Soulstice, we are a consulting firm and work with different types of clients. How we deliver Agile is really dependent on the client, the environment, and where they are in their transformation roadmap. In instances where, like Maria mentioned, what we tend to do is stand up, air quotes, a runway team, which allows us to do the delivery and the discovery from a UX and a research perspective. And to answer a question that was posted, that allows us to stay at least 1 to 2 sprints ahead of the delivery team, which ultimately allows us to pivot learn and provide handoff to the developers so that they have requirements and designs and a good understanding of what they're working on. So there's less of an opportunity for work to change while the developers are actively working on those user stories.
Mm-hmm. And I think that that's interesting, and we're going to get a little bit more into the workflow, but thank you, Carlene, for offering that insight, because I'm going to circle back around to you because I'm curious to know from a delivery manager, how is UX accounted for? But hang on tight to that because I'm coming back for you. Bryan, I believe one of the people in the audience said that they can't necessarily hear you, so if you could get closer to your microphone when it's your turn to speak, that would be great. But basically, now here's my opinion, guys, and please jump in and let me know if I missed the mark here. So here at our organization at CDW, we are considered Dualtrack Scrum, right? And so for those of you on the phone who may not necessarily be familiar with Dualtrack, which Marina also alluded to earlier, Dualtrack Scrum is I think Agile obviously is a development methodology. That's my opinion. It's a development methodology, and I think that UX kind of works around it. Anyhow, Dualtrack Scrum is basically discovery and delivery are happening at the same time. At least that's my understanding, that development and discovery is happening at the same time. Discovery in the form of perhaps proof of concept, to Marina and Bryan's point, what they alluded to earlier, perhaps a developer is sitting down with the UX person to kind of understand how they can deliver on the next feature. But when I think about the tracks that UX works on, I feel like UX works on a discovery track where they're doing research. And I know there was a question about how research can fit into this. And then there's this kind of refactoring track. So while you're in delivery, developers are tapping you because perhaps something is not understood or something may need to be refactored based on some type of new development that they discovered while in the sprint. And then again, you know, there's discovery, the research part, but then there's like the future state UX. So after you've done the research part, you have to actually put together the UX and the experience for that. And I guess my question to you guys is, you know, if we're truly doing Agile for UX teams, how does this workflow, like what does that workflow look like? At what point are you doing discovery? At what point are you helping developers refactor? At what point are you doing user experience design for your next feature? And how are you organizing that workflow? How are you logging that time?
I will say, as a delivery lead, what we do is, again, work in a runway model where we have the runway team who's focused on doing the research, the discovery design, getting sign-off, approvals, good understanding from the product owner, and ultimately working closely with the team, more or less in a program fashion. So another team member to take that work and create that and break that down into user stories, have the refinement and also a design review so that the developers and the other team members are fully versed in what's being developed, the intent of that feature, and so that the intent of that is carried over to what is executed. In my opinion, that is a really good way of doing it. I view software development as a creative endeavor, so it allows the developer to participate fully in that process. Developers on our teams tend to be very interested in the UX. Spencer, for one, will point out things that need to be adjusted, make recommendations for the backlog that would ultimately offer a much better user experience. And one thing that we also do to make sure that we carry through that common thread from the discovery work into delivery is what we'll do is have the designer sit with the developer after the story is developed. For one, you're reducing the number of defects. For two, you're making adjustments based on screen sizes and the different delivery tools that you're doing. If, for example, if you're using an ionic component, there may be limitations to that framework. So it really allows the developer and the UX person to collaborate. And so it's more of a collaborative effort and less of a handoff.
Yeah.
Nice. I like the idea of a handoff. Go ahead, Brian. Of not having a handoff.
I agree with everything Carlene just said. I mean, developers are creative people, and developers like to be.
So, yeah, I was gonna say, Brian, if you could speak up slightly, we're having a hard time here. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, that's a little better.
Sorry. Yeah, I agree with Carlene. Developers are creative people, and including them into discovery helps smooth out the delivery, in my experience. In terms of like the UX workflow, also in my experience, and I've experienced a lot of different flavors of Agile. In my experience, the double diamond fits right into the best type of Agile. Typically, in my experience, when the UX workflow isn't working, that tends to be more of a problem within the process where something is breaking down, and either the Scrum, because I see that more within Scrum, frankly, but that may not always be the case, but it's kind of where Scrum starts to lean back towards waterfall, and those waterfall demands start to creep in, and delivery demands start to creep in, and the focus tends to shift off. And I think that's where then the UX track starts to get a little, the double diamond starts to get derailed.
Interesting. Yeah, so we can talk about, that derailment. Go ahead, Spencer.
Yeah, I just want to kind of build on a few things that I've heard really just about the idea of development working alongside product and working alongside design. It's super important. One of the words that Bryan mentioned was empathy, and I think that's probably one of the biggest key takeaways that you get more on the job than you would in a school environment, is building empathy for the end user, right? This is what user experience is all about. User experience is not just about the design. It's really about everybody kind of taking an effort. A lot of things that you don't really get in design that you see in development is doing things for accessibility. So there's a lot of things in code that you have to write for accessibility that a lot of times you wouldn't really think about as a developer unless maybe you spent time with a researcher going out and talking to the end users and seeing who's going to be using whatever product you're developing. Really, it gives developers kind of like a larger look at the product as a whole, building up that empathy. And really that ends up making you a better developer, because as Carlene mentioned, you can be working with a designer as they're coming up with designs, and you can point out things that might not be possible or might not be accessible, or maybe there's a better way of doing something, things along that line. I think that's super important. I think it's really important for developers to be kind of seeing designs and seeing stories before they get approved, because a lot of times, we might have advice on how to make something better, or an issue that might arise. And it's much better to kind of make that known before you start development on it than it is when you're kind of developing, because it kind of throws people off a little bit. If you're starting development, UX is already working on the next set of designs. You have to go in and say, hey, let's go back to this thing we talked about last week. I'm seeing this issue, which then kind of takes time away from UX and the new stuff that they're doing. So it's good to work in tandem, I believe.
Also,
go ahead, Carlene.
Go ahead. To add to something that Spencer mentioned, which is really important, is cost, especially when you're approaching it from a consulting perspective. It is essential to have your architect or your lead developer, or however your team is organized, to be a part of the design conversations. You need to understand your capabilities, your limitations, what version you're on, and just have a good understanding. So that allows you to make good designs that are actually something that can be delivered. And also, to Spencer and Bryan's point, involving the developers and the other team members, the QA and everyone on the team, on a cross-functional team along into the design process, actually gives you a better product, because you have a diversity in opinions that allows you to surface things that you would never think about, if you're working alone.
I think this is all great feedback, and I think it's good to hear how different people are doing it in different environments. I guess my question is, because we don't have a product manager represented on the actual panel, But I want to get back to the workflow because I really think, and again, as a UX practitioner myself, when we talk about the workflow and how you're driving a roadmap and how far in advance are you doing discovery ahead of delivery, if you think about the product manager, I'm just curious to know, how do your product managers play into this workflow and into this process? And how are UX designers, are you guys as UX designers, are you managing your own workflow? And then of course, Carlene, that circles back to my question to you earlier, around how UX is actually accounted for in the process. But before we get to that, Carlene, just Bryan and Marina, like how are you guys working with your product managers? Like how are you working ahead of the sprint? How is discovery done in enough time so that you're actually not doing UX work during the delivery time period? Because I am not going to be the person to sit here and say that every sprint goes well every time.
Yeah.
There have been cases in different organizations where you're a UX designer and you're actually delivering at the same time that the developers are trying to deliver on the same feature. So tell me a little bit about that product manager process and that workflow ahead of development.
I mean, ideally, that's what retros are for, right? Like retros are purposefully in place to optimize your process. So if that's happening repeatedly, something's broken, right? And ideally, the PM is involved. The PMs and the POs are involved in the process. That's why you have that's why the whole team is structured that way. That's why instead of UX design, that's why we have the term product design, right? Product is about having those three people and those three different disciplines working together and collaborating together closely to create a lean and effective way to deliver, right? So that again, if this is happening a lot, then that means something has broken within the process, and that means your retros, you need to put action items into your retros, or think of a different format for your retros to be able to pull out of that and get to the why of why that's happening.
Speaking really tactically about our process, this is more specific to my team and my platform and not necessarily representative of the larger organization. But currently, as a design lead, I oversee a number of project spaces. So on a quarterly basis, I'll meet with my product and tech stakeholders to do a quarterly portfolio plan. And that's where we take a look at what some people might call epics, but some people call big bets. We take a look at the priorities for our project areas, and we'll put them in writing, and we'll get not necessarily granular, but we'll commit to delivering in project areas on a quarterly basis, and it will be a directive for product and tech and design. And at that time, we all know that we're kind of shooting towards the same North Star, but as a UX designer, the UX team will have flexibility to deliver within that quarter as we see fit. So because we are not federated directly to products, or I should say projects, sometimes we'll be working on really large scale discovery projects that are ongoing over the course of a year, and we'll go back and we'll continue to make progress there, while also keeping in mind the things that we committed to for the quarterly plan. So sometimes that means we're doing whiteboarding sessions, we're doing interactive prototypes, we're doing user testing in a cyclical flow within that quarter to make sure that we're meeting delivery timelines. We'll be including product and tech, while also, again, maintaining the larger scope of discovery that's going to inform us as designers, what our audience wants, how they're reacting to the product overall versus on a feature by feature level. One other thing I can add, I just lost my train of thought. Yeah, I'll stop there. Oh, actually, yeah, I'll say we do PI planning. So we're working with tech on a 12-week basis to plan what's going to go into delivery. And design is less involved in that because we kind of rely more on our product partners to be working on the microservices based on the portfolio plan. So it's not something that I need to dedicate my time to and work on the feature level implementation and delivery. But I rely on my product partners to reach out to me when we have questions around flows or implementation.
And I'm glad you brought up the PI planning because we do have a question that has come into the group, and it's specifically about the SAFE framework and how does UX fit into the SAFE PI planning. I think two of our audience members today have had questions about the SAFE framework. Me personally, I am not familiar, but if you guys are familiar and can talk to that, in addition to SAFE PI planning, that would be excellent.
Yeah, I mean, I've had the same experience Marina's had with the PI planning and going into that. I can't honestly say I'm a big fan of SAFE. I understand why big organizations think that it's going to help them, and it's nice that they've created an accurate acronym that also makes it sound safe. But the design and discovery are not really part of that process, and they're not even accounted for in that process. And the people that designed SAFE did not include design into thinking into that process, or where discovery was going to be in that process. So there's a lot of confusion, I think, that SAFE adds. SAFE also has, in our organization, I don't know how it is with other organizations, but there are multiple names that SAFE sometimes assigns in terms of product owners, product managers that do not necessarily translate over to who we have as product owners and product managers, and that builds more confusion. So yeah, I can't say I'm a fan of SAFE. I understand why it's in place, but I'm not a fan.
And if you guys, and I think Carlene, you're familiar with the Scale Agile framework. I am not really familiar. So Carlene, if you could just give kind of like just a highlight of like what this framework is for those of us who are on the call who are not necessarily familiar.
Absolutely. So when we think of Agile, just to step back and level set, so Agile is an umbrella term, and it just talks about iterative ways of managing projects. And if you think to it on the left side, you have the lightweight methods, which would be your Scrum or your XP, where you have these ceremonies, and it's just a little bit scrappy. So it allows you to move and pivot quickly and iteratively, and you're working with smaller teams. On the right side is where you have your more heavyweight methodologies, and SAFE, Scaled Agile Framework, would be on that side. Scaled Agile Framework is a method that large enterprise organizations tend to use. It allows them to hold on to some of the planning and the waterfall-esque overhead that they need in some cases in order to plan and work with the PMO on budgeting and just projecting out further on what they need in the roadmap to meet whatever market demands or organizational needs that they have. Within the SAFE framework, it is really important to understand at the very top, you have the portfolio level, which Marina spoke to. In the middle is the program level, but most importantly on the bottom level is the team level. And at the team level, it provides you the flexibility to run in some of those lighter weight frameworks, such as the Scrum or the XP. So any of those methods would be appropriate to use within the SAFE framework. What I believe Marina and Bryan had alluded to is what I've seen is that UX is really not as represented in the PI planning. PI planning is a 2-day meeting where everyone, all hands on deck, comes together, and they have this big planning exercise to understand what they'll be building over the next 12 weeks or so. And from that, there's a roadmap that's maintained at the program level, and the teams create their backlogs per sprint to match whatever that roadmap item is. I have to say that I'm totally in agreement with Bryan. The way that SAFe can be implemented speaks very much to waterfall, and it allows you to fall back into some of those patterns. The thing that I see most that most resistant to is taking away control from the local teams. The teams do need to have the opportunity to be creative, think through the eyes of the customer, build empathy, and be able to make decisions locally. SAFe does prescribe for some local decisions, but it's more restricted. But what I'm meaning is that if something's happening in the market and you're aware of it, you should be able to pivot so you're delivering the next best product that ships out the door should speak to those things. And in a lot of ways, SAFe restricts the ability at the developer level, which is kind of not agile in some sense.
Yeah.
Interesting. And you guys keep saying PI planning. What is PI? What does that mean?
A PI is a product increment. So essentially a PI plan is a roadmap. So to tie back to your original question of the process. And so you'd have this PI plan with, as Marina said, epics. Those are broken down to sprints. Sprints can be 1 week XP or 2 weeks Scrum or up to 4 weeks. Not prescriptive, based on the organization, based on the team. My sweet spot tends to be 2 weeks. Less overhead with sprint planning and the retros and the demos. Those take time. But PI planning really is your roadmap, and it allows you to organize by sprint. How we create our process is to take a look at that roadmap and start working really closely with, heavily with UX, research, and what we call product or the BA. And those individuals are putting their heads together along with the tech individuals and also the product owner in the traditional sense. And they're really just wrapping their minds around what this thing should be, what this feature is. They're getting really creative. No opinions are bad opinions. So instead of no, it's yes, but, so that everyone feels included and you have the conversation. You're building out your sprint plan, and ultimately it goes to your team.
So now we're talking about these different methodologies. At this point, who's owning what, right? So we talked about the Dualtrack Scrum, we talked about the extreme programming, we were talking about SAFe. Depending on those methodologies, like who's the driver of that and who's owning what? In a traditional sense, again, my experience with Scrum and Dualtrack is that the PO is owning this and running it. And the other methodologies, like who's running what?
So I will say that one thing that we want to stay clear of, regardless of the method that we choose, whether it's SAFe, Scrum, XP, whatever, is to make sure that there's full ownership across the team. The moment you have a owner, you really start losing the involvement of the team members. Team members are less likely to raise their hands and raise issues. So at the team level, again, whether it's SAFe or whatever method you're using, at the team level, it's owned by the team, and generally there's a Scrum Master or product owner in XP or whatever the title is, and that team is responsible for working that backlog, whatever that sprint commitment is, and it bubbles up to air quotes the program level in the case of Scrum to make sure that we're on track to deliver this cohesive thing that that the organization has committed to.
So then who helps kind of drive that? I guess I'm curious to know, like, who's the owner of the ceremonies? Is this, like, just hypothetically speaking, we're all in a team together. We all exist to co-own this product. But then when it comes to driving the ceremonies, when it comes to driving, like, the roadmap dollars, we talked about money earlier. When it comes to talking about feasibility, like, who's driving these parts of the process, I guess?
When you say who's driving, are you talking about who's driving in terms of SAFe, or are you talking about who's driving in terms of product in general?
Product in general.
Product in general, I mean, it's technology, design, products. All three together own the process. All three together. Jared Spool just had recently tweeted about how if you're designing any part of if you're influencing the design, you're one of the designers, right? And like, so all three of those people together, design's a team sport. Everybody's got to work together to design the thing. And us as designers, we're helping facilitate that and helping make that happen. The new model is not going to be the person in the cube, banging away, working off requirements and shooting out a deliverable. So one thing I want to talk about that Carlene mentioned that was like spot on too is that just going back to SAFe and kind of the waterfall-y bits of it, you know, a lot of these people, it does two things that reinforces pretty bad habits, which is the expectation of a delivery dates, one. And then the second thing that it does is it reinforces the senior managers and leadership that honestly have their compensation models are tied into those delivery structures. So they're more about delivery date than an actual outcome. And part of what needs to happen with Agile is like, it needs to be more about what is the outcome that you're driving towards. And you should let the boots on the ground, as Carlene said, be able to make those determinations. Jim Mattis, who is a Marine who was just recently the Secretary of Defense, was just talking about how Marines are creative as boots on the ground because of the fact that they are given an objective and then they have to figure out how to reach that objective versus told which door to kick in. So
I agree with the outcomes versus the output. I think everybody is in a hurry to deliver and be the first to deliver it. So I think that that's an interesting point that you raised, Bryan. And I want to ask one more question before we open it up to the rest of the audience to ask some questions. I want to get some of the questions done in the chat and in the Q&A section from the audience. I wanted to talk about some of the ceremonies. So when we talk about some of the ceremonies that take place in Agile specifically, from your perspective, are there any ceremonies that should be done differently or not needed from a UX perspective? And any one of you guys are free to kind of weigh in on that. Spencer? I think you want to go first.
I kind of have a love-hate relationship with daily stand-ups, and I liked what Marina said a little bit earlier about how she doesn't have one. I find that it's really situational. Sometimes during stand-up, I say my stand-up, and then I'm sitting there kind of like zoning out or thinking about what I'm going to build, because the other things that people are doing, it's the same thing constantly day to day. So stand-up kind of like it seems to be like one of these core parts of Scrum that I feel like needs to be revisited a little bit, and just to talk about like, do you really need a daily stand-up kind of thing? That one I'm not really sure. I think could be revisited by each team, you know, throughout the process of product development. I think my favorite ceremony is probably the retrospective, and I just think, you know, I look at retrospectives as kind of like mini therapy sessions, and therapy never hurt nobody. So I really like that. You know, a lot of times you get a really good team, you know, that can be, you know, really honest with each other. You know, a retrospective is supposed to be a safe place for you to be able to say, okay, here's what like technically went well and what technically didn't go well. But also, like, I was pair programming with you and you were eating a lot of garlic chips, and I sit next to you for 6 hours a day and it was really uncomfortable for me. You know, stuff like that. Like it just kind of opens the floor to, you know, I guess getting deep or just kind of problem solving and making sure that your next iteration goes better. That one is probably my favorite.
Absolutely. Marina?
Yeah. I do love not having a daily stand-up. One, for the fact that sometimes you're context switching so much every day that you don't even do the thing that you said you were going to do. One of my favorite ceremonies, and this is again in the context of a really large organization where we're not all co-located, is the design QA. And it's different for every project and it's different for every team. Sometimes it's just one-on-one, sometimes it's a huge 1 hour long demo. But I love being able to talk to the tech team about what we're building, answer any questions along the way, and then see the product come to fruition and be able to pull up the side-by-side prototype with what's in market. And then it's really interesting to work with different people around how they like to make the changes. So is it a technical spec doc? Is it refer to the existing CSS? Is it just like send me that updated hex value on Slack. Depending on the teams, those are some of the best conversations, and then you get to see the project come to life. And then because sometimes we're working at different paces to deliver the work, or different teams are working on different schedules, it's a really good sign off to get everyone's eyes on it and be able to say like, yep, design says this is good, let's see it in market, and hit me with the spec doc.
Cool. And anyone else want to add about the ceremonies?
I would just say that sometimes the ceremonies become a trap where it's like thought of as required, but it should really be how they're done, and whether they're done should be up to the teams. Like the team should determine that, and maybe kind of change gears. But also, like sometimes people think that they are doing working waterfall, but they just attach the ceremonies on and go, aha, we're agile, and it's like that's not how it works.
Yeah, I would add to that, that starting out with a new team, it's really important to stick to the prescribed ceremonies as much as possible. And as Bryan mentioned, no two teams are the same, no two organizations are the same. So just being in tune with the team and seeing what works, what doesn't work, and dialing those back to meet the needs of the team. There's no value in a retro if no one's participating. That's a wasted hour. One thing I can say for sure, having worked with Spencer, retros are his favorite. They absolutely are. And for me, one thing that I do like when ceremony is the demos, and working with developers or the QA individuals to actually deliver the demos. I find it is a good opportunity as a good stretch for those individuals who generally would not be in a facilitation role. So just seeing those individuals step out of the day-to-day coding or testing and lead a demo in front of leadership is something that I really like to see the growth in those individuals.
Okay, and I know I want to get to a few of the questions that we have here. I saw someone, Sue Ann, just raised her hand. Sue Ann, I'm trying to find your question so we can make sure we get to it. I think she's definitely itching to get hers done, and so is Salme. So I believe there is a question a little bit more about a ceremony that you mentioned, Marina, and I think that that ceremony could be design QA. I think there's a question around what that ceremony is, and is it part of UAT?
Is it part of UAT?
Yes, that's the question that I have here.
Okay. I don't know what UAT means, but I can speak to design QA. I will work with a tech team and a product team to deliver a project. Different tech teams have access to different design tools, so I can't always send over my sketch file. Sometimes it'll be working off of an existing style guide, or just kind of making updates to an existing product. So every project gets treated differently, but the ceremony is essentially a delivery manager and the lead developer, or whoever was delivering on the intent, demoing the work that they've done, being able to show it either in a sandbox or in like a dark production state, so that I, as the designer, can make sure that the designs look the way that I've handed them over, but also that they are functioning in the way that we expect them to. So if there's a drawer, does it close correctly? Is there any animation? Also kind of, it's also a way to check for bugs. So sometimes that's not what I'm looking for, but it's a way to get everyone on the team's eyes on the product and make sure that we're all communicating about the same thing and that it's meeting everyone's expectations. This has lasted anywhere from 15 minutes to an hour and a half, depending on what I'm delivering. And we schedule those meetings ad hoc based on what we're delivering, if it's going to market or if it's just kind of an update on a larger project before it goes in market.
And as the crowd has said, UAT is user acceptance testing, which brings up a really, a really good point about like who's writing acceptance criteria, who's writing user stories, and things like that. But we'll get into that discussion at another time. We do have a question about this UX discovery backlog. Is that maintained separately from a product backlog? So again, we're thinking about that workflow of where UX and research is occurring versus delivery and product ownership. So any questions about that?
I don't think, I mean, ideally it shouldn't be. Ideally it's the entire team's responsibility.
Totally agree, Brian. I think it's really important to not silo UX from UX and research from the rest of the team. UX is a part of the team and should be co-located and with the cross-functional team as much as possible. So UX should be participating in all the ceremonies plus the additional meetings like the user refinement, the UX reviews, as Marina alluded to, and design reviews, as we call it, where developers are introduced to a feature and walk through the design and the interactions and things like that. But UX should be a part of the team. Generally what happens is that you try to get at least one sprint ahead. So initially, to answer Shane's question, it is heavy lifting up front where you're just putting in a ton of hours initially to get the to get ahead. So you're working on product, design and all those other things, just trying to get ready for the sprint 2. And as Carm had alluded to, there may be an opportunity where all the designs may not be ready for the sprint, but that's where the synergy of the team comes in. If the developers trust the UX person and you have this relationship and the assets are going to be delivered by a certain time, that's totally okay. But just working heads down to get the initial backlog ahead with stories and designs and research is where you're going to see the benefit of having those two teams working closer together.
I guess that's kind of where I'm confused at, though, because at that point, if UX is just working to keep the lights on, if they're just working on roadmaps, like where does the innovation and the creativity come in? Where does the actual research and the discovery, come in for a future state? Like how is that, gone? Like how does that factor into the process if the only thing that we're doing is keeping a roadmap and working to that roadmap and UX not having maybe a separate backlog?
So if you're working and researching and you're doing that ahead of the sprint, ideally, if you did the heavy lifting and you started off the project and you have, say, 2 sprints worth, and then you're looking for, you always want to be forward looking with UX and research and product. And the reason is that if a feature blows up or there's some change in the market and you need to pivot, really you want to do is say, hey, we're going to move to these set of stories and unblock the team. Otherwise, you're going to be in a constant state of trying to catch up. So regardless, it's really important to get ahead. And depending on the allocation and the focus, if you have one researcher who's split across multiple teams, capacity may be an issue, but it's really important whether or not you do a runway team to do discovery and a delivery team, you want to keep those individuals in sync and you want to run a couple of sprints or release ahead.
I don't know. I guess I kind of torn on that. I guess it feels almost safe for like UX to have its discovery backlog in addition to including like roadmap. That's just my opinion. I could totally be wrong. I'm just wondering at what point is UX not just working to keep the lights on, but actually, working in the discovery phase ahead of time, kind of taking ownership of what the experience could be like, rather than what the product manager or the product owner or the business is telling them what the roadmap should be.
But why would they?
So I think you wanted to.
But why would they be when the UX and product design is responsible for the delivery end, right? Like that's part of their execution point. So if they're responsible for develop to deliver, which is the half of the whole diamond, and then why isn't product and development also involved in discover and define? Like both of those things.
I think they could be. I think they could be, but I don't think that the UX team can't actually own a backlog. I don't think that the UX team has to subscribe to one backlog and it has to be the product backlog. I'm saying, like, could the UX team, have, and that was the question that was posed, like, can the UX team have, like, this discovery backlog where the innovation and the magic is occurring, and maybe they're driving that backlog and, of course, inviting product and development into it. But if we're just all subscribing to the one product roadmap and the product owner is owning that, at what point is the innovation occurring? Not saying that innovation is not occurring, but are there other ways to do that?
I think I hear what you're saying. I mean, in our case, like, we've used Trello as like our on the discovery end, and we include our developers and our product managers into that. And then Pivotal Tracker is what we use for our development end. But, like, all of us write stories. Everybody on the team writes stories. PMs, designers, developers. Everybody writes stories.
I like the idea of writing stories. Our UX designers are now responsible for writing them as well. I just feel like when it comes to acceptance criteria and functionality, nobody knows it's better than the UX and the developer, that's for sure. We do have some other questions I want to get in. We have some there was a question that came in earlier that says, hey, what happens if the product owner is trying to drive the design? What do you do in that case?
Tell them no.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I think that's where the being the lead, the engagement or the transformation lead comes in. So initially, you definitely want to have the contract, for lack of a better word, on how we're going to behave. As Bryan had mentioned earlier, working in Agile is a very different way of working. Management feels challenged. A lot of times when it's first implemented, you'll hear, well, what am I supposed to do? And what am I supposed to do? The answer to that is to be creative and work on the future state. So that's the answer. But whenever you're having someone take ownership and perform in a role that they shouldn't necessarily be working in, it's really having a upfront conversation, revisiting the roles, and talking through how you can work more collaboratively, and using the refinement as a safe space to bring that up, and offering not only I don't like this, but ultimately also how about we take this approach to mitigate the issue.
Excellent. And I do want to get this one last question in for the researchers, because I know there's a ton of researchers that are on the line, and they're really trying to understand, like, how does UX research, A/B testing, how does this fit into the process, if at all?
Research kind of exists in multiple phases, right? There's the idea where you have a product that you're going to build, and you might have some folks that are like, I know I want to build this product, and I know exactly what's going to go into it. But until you actually talk to the people that you're building it for, you have no idea. There's like this famous instance of this really cool watch that was going to be made for like factory line workers, and it developed and went all the way through the development process just to find out that people working on a factory line are not going to wear a watch because there's a danger of getting their hand caught in the machine and losing a hand. And that's like a big use case that's talked about, but it's really important in the very beginning to, when you say, I have a product, let me actually go find out if this is useful. And then if it's useful, what's to put in it? And then you get an idea of, what a user is looking for, and you go through that design phase, get some more feedback from users on your initial designs, and you start development. And then even once something is done being developed, and Marina talks a little bit about this too, is that you take those features and you present them to users, and you don't necessarily guide them through it. You just kind of give it to them, and you might say, do this task, but you don't tell them how to do it. And that's how you kind of learn if what you're building it makes sense. If people know how to use your application or your product intuitively, it's really important, a really good researcher is going to know how to conduct those user research sessions by not kind of asking leading questions and stuff like that.
Absolutely. Anybody else wanted to chime in? Because I know we got like one more minute.
I'll add, it speaks to the question that you brought up a little earlier about a dedicated product roadmap versus a UX roadmap. we tell our partners, again, going back to portfolio planning, that we are planning to do vision work. And so we make them aware that we are dedicating our time to future thinking, to UX research, to user insights, to understand where problem areas are for our own benefit as UX designers, to later inform the strategy around the product. But also on a day-to-day basis, implementing research is really like, what do we need to know? Do we need to drive people through this flow? And is it quick and dirty, or do we need to do more in-depth interviews and spend time and refine and do some cyclical research? But I think that there's never a bad time for research and getting insights. It's just a matter of, do you apply that to a product right away, or do you store that in your UX library of what you're going to apply down the road?
Okay. Well, guys, we are at time. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. Thank you for, being really candid about how Agile is working in your organizations. Thank you all to the panelists who have attended today. Please be sure to check the UXTA website in the Education tab for all of our upcoming panels, webinars, and short courses. Again, October and November are dedicated to data and data visualization, so be sure to tune in to the short course and the webinar. All right, thank you, everyone.
Thank you
Bye.
for doing this. It was great.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
All righty.